Sarah Martinez had always been careful about her tattoo. The small compass rose on her left shoulder blade remained hidden beneath her military uniform, just another piece of ink that dozens of soldiers carried as personal reminders of home, love, or dreams. At 24, she had served 3 years in the Army, working her way up to sergeant in the communications unit at Fort Campbell. Her days were filled with radio equipment, satellite connections, and the endless chatter of military communications that kept the base running smoothly. The tattoo itself seemed ordinary enough. A simple black compass rose about 2 inches across with delicate line work that pointed in the 4 cardinal directions. Most people who glimpsed it during off-duty hours at the gym or pool assumed it represented her love of travel or adventure. Sarah never corrected them. The truth was far more complicated, and she had learned long ago that some stories were better kept to herself. She had gotten the tattoo during her first leave after basic training in a small shop outside Fort Benning, Georgia. The elderly tattoo artist, a Vietnam veteran named Eddie, had worked on it with unusual care. He had studied the design she brought in for nearly an hour before agreeing to do the work. Sarah remembered how his weathered hands had trembled slightly as he prepared the ink, and how he had asked her 3 times if she was certain about the placement and the exact details of the design. "You sure about these markings, young lady?" Eddie had asked, pointing to tiny symbols she had requested around each point of the compass. They looked like decorative flourishes to most people, but Sarah knew better. Her grandfather had drawn those exact symbols on a piece of paper before his death, along with coordinates and a story that had haunted her family for decades. Life at Fort Campbell had settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah excelled at her job, earned the respect of her fellow soldiers, and had even started dating Marcus, a fellow sergeant in the motor pool. Her roommate, Jennifer, was her closest friend. On base, and the 2 women had planned to extend their service contracts and possibly pursue officer training together. Sarah felt like she was finally building something solid, something that belonged entirely to her. The tattoo rarely drew attention. During inspections, it was covered by her uniform. During PT, she wore shirts that kept it hidden. On the rare occasions when someone did notice it, they would make casual comments about the design or ask about the tattoo shop where she had gotten it done. Sarah had perfected a bland response about liking the symbolism of direction and navigation, and most people lost interest quickly. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when the new commanding officer arrived at Fort Campbell. Colonel James Harrison was a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for running tight operations. He was tall, graying at the temples, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made junior soldiers straighten their spines when he walked into a room. Sarah first saw him during the change of command ceremony, where their previous CO officially handed over control of the base operations. Colonel Harrison gave a brief speech about maintaining excellence, supporting each other, and upholding the traditions of their unit. His voice was steady and professional, but Sarah noticed how his eyes seemed to take in every detail of the assembled troops. This was a man who noticed things, she realized, and that made her slightly uncomfortable in a way she could not explain. For the first few weeks after Colonel Harrison's arrival, Sarah's daily routine remained unchanged. She reported to the communications center each morning, managed her team of junior soldiers, and handled the complex web of radio and satellite communications that connected their base to operations around the world. She was good at her job, had excellent performance reviews, and stayed out of trouble. There was no reason for the new commanding officer to pay any particular attention to one sergeant among the hundreds under his command. The first sign that something was different came during a routine equipment inspection. Colonel Harrison had begun making unannounced visits to various departments, learning about operations and meeting the soldiers under his command. When he visited the communications center, Sarah was bent over a radio console, troubleshooting a connection issue with a unit deployed overseas. She wore her standard uniform, everything properly in place, focused entirely on solving the technical problem. Colonel Harrison moved through the room, asking questions about equipment and procedures. Sarah's supervisor, Lieutenant Chen, walked him through their operations while Sarah continued working. She was aware of their conversation in the background, but remained focused on her task. The connection issue was complicated, requiring her to trace through multiple relay points and check various settings. "Sergeant Martinez," Lieutenant Chen called. "Could you brief the colonel on the satellite communication protocols?" Sarah straightened up and turned around, snapping to attention, as she had done thousands of times before. "Yes, sir," she replied, launching into a clear explanation of their communication systems, backup procedures, and security protocols. Colonel Harrison listened intently, asking detailed questions that showed he understood the technical aspects of their work. It was during this conversation that Sarah noticed Colonel Harrison's eyes. They were sharp and focused, but there was something else there, something that made her feel like he was seeing more than just another soldier giving a briefing. His questions were professional and appropriate, but she sensed an undercurrent of something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up slightly. The inspection concluded without incident. Colonel Harrison thanked the team for their dedication and moved on to his next appointment. Sarah returned to her work, but she found herself replaying the interaction in her mind. There had been something in the way he looked at her. Something that felt different from the casual attention of a commanding officer learning about his troops. That evening, as she and Jennifer grabbed dinner at the mess hall, Sarah mentioned the inspection. "The new CO seems sharp," she said, picking at her meal. "Really knows his stuff." Jennifer nodded. "I heard he was Special Forces before taking command positions. Spent a lot of time in some pretty intense places." She paused. "Why? Did something happen during the inspection?" Sarah shook her head, though she was not entirely convinced herself. "No, nothing specific. Just got the feeling he was really paying attention, you know? Like he was seeing everything." What Sarah did not know was that Colonel Harrison had indeed noticed something during their brief interaction. As she had turned to face him, giving her professional briefing about communication protocols, her uniform had shifted slightly. For just a moment, as she gestured toward one of the radio units, the collar of her uniform had pulled back just enough to reveal the very edge of her tattoo. Most people would have missed it entirely, or dismissed it as just another piece of military ink. But Colonel Harrison was not most people, and what he thought he had seen in that brief glimpse would change everything. Colonel Harrison returned to his office that afternoon with his mind churning. He sat behind his desk, staring at reports that suddenly seemed less important than the brief glimpse he had caught of Sergeant Martinez's tattoo. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the stress of taking over a new command was making him see connections that did not exist. But 30 years in the military had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something significant had just crossed his path. He pulled up Sergeant Martinez's personnel file on his computer. Sarah Elena Martinez, born in El Paso, Texas. Parents: Maria Martinez, a high school teacher, and deceased father Carlos Martinez, who had died in a car accident when Sarah was 16. Grandfather: Eduardo Martinez, also deceased. Clean service record, excellent performance evaluations, security clearance current and unblemished. Nothing in the file suggested anything unusual about this young soldier, but Harrison knew that personnel files only told part of the story. He had learned long ago that the most important information was often found in the spaces between the official records. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, thinking about the symbol he thought he had seen. A compass rose was common enough, but the markings around it, the specific way the lines were drawn, had triggered a memory from deep in his past. 25 years earlier, Harrison had been a young Special Forces officer deployed to Central America during the final years of the Cold War. His unit had been involved in operations that officially never happened, supporting local forces against Soviet-backed insurgents. It was dangerous, complicated work that required building relationships with local contacts, many of whom risked their lives to provide intelligence to American forces. One of their most valuable contacts had been a man named Eduardo Martinez, a former Mexican military officer who had settled in Honduras and built a network of informants throughout the region. Eduardo was in his 60s then, a quiet man with sharp eyes who seemed to know everything that moved through the mountains and jungles of Central America. He had provided Harrison's unit with intelligence that had saved dozens of American lives, and helped turn the tide of several key operations. Eduardo had been marked for death by the insurgents. Harrison still remembered the night they had received word that Eduardo's location had been compromised. His unit had mounted a desperate rescue operation, fighting through enemy lines to reach the small village where Eduardo was hiding. They had found him wounded but alive, along with his adult son Carlos, who had refused to abandon his father. The extraction had been harrowing. Under cover of darkness, they had moved Eduardo and Carlos to a safe house, then eventually arranged for them to be smuggled across the border into Mexico. Eduardo had been grateful but worried about his family members who remained behind. Before they parted ways, he had given Harrison something that had stayed with him for decades, a hand-drawn map showing the location of several weapons caches and safe houses that Eduardo's network had established. The map had been drawn on a simple piece of paper, but Eduardo had marked it with specific symbols that he explained were known only to his most trusted contacts. The symbols were disguised as decorative elements around a compass rose, but each one had a specific meaning that could help identify other members of Eduardo's network. Harrison had memorized the symbols and the map, then destroyed the original, as protocol required. Now, sitting in his office at Fort Campbell, Harrison tried to recall the exact details of those symbols. Had they looked like what he thought he had seen on Sergeant Martinez's tattoo? The connection seemed impossible, but the timing would be about right. Eduardo would have been in his 60s in the 1990s, making him old enough to be the grandfather of a soldier now in her 20s. And the name Martinez was certainly consistent. Harrison spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on his normal duties, but his mind kept returning to the question. He reviewed base operations, met with his staff, and worked through a stack of reports, but part of his attention remained fixed on the puzzle of Sergeant Martinez and her tattoo. That evening, he found himself walking through the base, ostensibly conducting informal inspections but actually hoping to catch another glimpse of the tattoo that had captured his attention. He visited the motor pool, the mess hall, and the recreation center, but saw no sign of Sergeant Martinez. He felt slightly foolish, like a detective chasing shadows, but the nagging feeling would not leave him alone. Meanwhile, Sarah was having dinner with Marcus at a small restaurant off base. They had been dating for 6 months, and their relationship had settled into a comfortable routine of shared meals, weekend trips, and long conversations about their futures in the military. Marcus was everything Sarah had thought she wanted. Stable, caring, funny, and completely supportive of her career goals. "You seem distracted tonight," Marcus observed, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "Everything okay?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just thinking about work. The new CO seems really hands-on. I get the feeling he's going to change how we do things." "Change can be good," Marcus said. "Maybe it'll mean more opportunities for advancement." Sarah nodded, but she could not shake the feeling that Colonel Harrison's arrival meant something more than just new leadership. There had been something in his eyes during that brief interaction, something that felt personal rather than professional. She had spent years learning to read people, to sense when someone was seeing more than they were letting on, and Colonel Harrison had definitely been seeing something. After dinner, Sarah and Marcus returned to base and went their separate ways. To their respective barracks, Sarah found Jennifer reading in their shared room, and the two women settled into their usual evening routine of casual conversation and preparation for the next day. "Did you hear about the new training exercises Colonel Harrison is planning?" Jennifer asked, not looking up from her book. "No, what about them?" "Apparently he wants to run some kind of advanced communication scenarios, really complex stuff, testing how well our systems can handle unusual situations." Jennifer closed her book and looked at Sarah. "Word is he's specifically asked for our unit to be involved. Lieutenant Chen thinks it means we're being considered for some kind of special assignment." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Special assignments often meant increased scrutiny, detailed background investigations, and the kind of attention she had always tried to avoid. Her tattoo had remained her secret for 3 years, but special assignments had a way of bringing secrets to light. Did Lieutenant Chen say what kind of special assignment? No details yet, just that Colonel Harrison has been asking a lot of questions about our capabilities and the experience levels of individual team members. Jennifer paused. He apparently asked specifically about you. The chill Sarah had felt earlier turned into something closer to panic. About me? What kind of questions? Professional stuff, from what Lieutenant Chen said. Your technical skills, leadership potential, security clearance level. The kind of questions that usually come before someone gets recommended for advanced training or promotion opportunity. Sarah tried to appear pleased by this news, but her mind was racing. In her experience, when commanding officers started asking specific questions about individual soldiers, it meant one of two things. Either they were being considered for advancement, or they were being investigated for something. Given the strange way Colonel Harrison had looked at her during the inspection, Sarah was beginning to suspect it might be the latter. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about her grandfather's stories and the compass, rose tattoo that had seemed like such a good way to honor his memory. Eduardo Martinez had been a complicated man with a complicated past, and Sarah was beginning to wonder if that past was about to catch up with her in ways she had never imagined. The symbols around her compass rose were not just decorative elements. They were a code, a way of identifying herself to others who might recognize their significance. Her grandfather had made her memorize their meaning before his death, along with stories about places and people from his time in Central America. Sarah had thought those stories were just the memories of an old man, but now she was starting to wonder if they might be something much more dangerous. The next morning brought an unexpected summons. Sarah was in the middle of running diagnostics on the satellite communication equipment when Lieutenant Chen approached her workstation with an official-looking memo in his hand. "Sergeant Martinez, you're wanted in the colonel's office at 900 hours, he said, his expression neutral but his eyes showing curiosity. "No indication what it's about, but you should probably bring your service record file." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Did I do something wrong, sir?" "Not that I'm aware of. Could be about those special training exercises he's planning. You're one of our best technical specialists." Lieutenant Chen paused. "But bring your dress uniform just in case. Sometimes these meetings turn into something more formal than expected." The walk to Colonel Harrison's office felt longer than usual. Sarah had changed into her dress uniform, gathered her service records, and tried to prepare for whatever was coming. She had spent the early morning hours thinking through every possible reason why the commanding officer might want to see her privately. None of her theories made her feel any better. Colonel Harrison's secretary, Master Sergeant Williams, showed Sarah into the office exactly at 9 o'clock. The colonel was standing behind his desk reviewing a folder that Sarah suspected contained her personnel file. He looked up as she entered, and again she felt that same strange sensation of being truly seen rather than just observed. "Sergeant Martinez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Colonel Harrison's voice was professional but not unfriendly. He closed the folder and sat down across from her. "I've been reviewing your service record. Impressive work in communications, excellent performance evaluations, strong recommendations from your supervisors. Thank you, sir. I'm particularly interested in your technical skills and your security clearance level. We're developing some new communication protocols that will require soldiers with both technical expertise and unquestionable reliability." He leaned forward slightly. "But before we discuss that, I'd like to ask you about your family background." Sarah's pulse quickened. "My family background, sir? Your grandfather, Eduardo Martinez. I see in your emergency contact information that he's listed as deceased, but there's not much detail about his background. What can you tell me about him?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected questions about her job, performance, her goals, maybe even her relationship with Marcus. She had not expected Colonel Harrison to ask about her grandfather, especially not in a tone that suggested he might already know some of the answers. "He died when I was 19, sir. He was a good man, very proud of my decision to serve in the military." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. "He had some military experience himself, though he didn't talk about it much." "What kind of military experience?" Sarah hesitated. This was exactly the kind of conversation she had hoped to avoid for her entire military career. Her grandfather's stories had been filled with references to places, operations, and people that seemed to exist in the shadows of official history. She had always assumed they were the embellished memories of an old man, but Colonel Harrison's questions suggested otherwise. He served in the Mexican military when he was younger, and I think he did some work with American forces in Central America during the 1980s and 1990s. But he was always vague about the details. Sarah met Colonel Harrison's eyes directly. "Sir, may I ask why you're interested in my grandfather's military service?" Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base activities beyond his office. "Sergeant Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Do you have any tattoos or markings that might relate to your grandfather's military service?" Sarah's heart was pounding now. The moment she had been unconsciously dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. She could lie, claim that her tattoo was just a personal design with no deeper meaning. But something in Colonel Harrison's tone suggested that he already knew more than he was letting on. "Yes, sir. I have a compass rose tattoo that includes some symbols my grandfather showed me before he died. He said they were important to our family history." Colonel Harrison turned back to face her. "Would you be willing to show me that tattoo?" The request was highly irregular. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have been within her rights to refuse or to request that a female officer be present, but these were clearly not normal circumstances, and Colonel Harrison's entire demeanor suggested that this meeting was about something much more significant than a routine personnel review. "Yes, sir." Sarah stood up and began to unbutton her uniform jacket. She turned slightly and moved the collar of her shirt to reveal the compass rose tattoo on her left shoulder blade. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, studying the tattoo with the focused attention of someone examining an important document. Sarah could feel his eyes tracing the lines of the compass rose and the small symbols that surrounded it. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back. "You can button up your jacket, Sergeant." His voice was different now, carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Those symbols around your compass rose. Do you know what they mean?" "My grandfather taught me what each one represents, but I'm not sure I understand their real significance." Colonel Harrison returned to his desk and opened a different folder. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to Sarah. The image was old and grainy, clearly taken decades earlier, but Sarah recognized her grandfather immediately. He was younger in the photo, probably in his 40s, standing with a group of soldiers in jungle camouflage. One of the soldiers in the photo was clearly a younger version of Colonel Harrison. "Your grandfather saved my life, Sergeant Martinez. Multiple times, actually. He was one of the bravest men I ever served with, and one of the most important intelligence assets the United States had in Central America during some very difficult years." Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. Her grandfather had told her stories about working with American soldiers, but she had never imagined that one of those soldiers might one day become her commanding officer. "The symbols on your tattoo are recognition codes," Colonel Harrison continued. "Eduardo developed them as a way for trusted contacts to identify each other in the field. Each symbol has a specific meaning, and only people who worked directly with Eduardo's network would recognize their significance." "Sir, I had no idea that—" "Your grandfather never told you the full extent of his work with American forces, did he?" Sarah shook her head. "He told me stories, but they always seemed, I don't know, maybe exaggerated, like the kind of tales old soldiers tell to make their experiences sound more exciting." Colonel Harrison smiled grimly. "Eduardo was many things, but he was never one to exaggerate. If anything, he probably told you less than the full truth about what he did and the risks he took." He paused. "The question now is what we do with this information." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "Sir, your grandfather's network was never fully dismantled, Sergeant. Some of the people he worked with are still alive, still active, and still in positions where they could provide valuable intelligence to the United States. The symbols on your tattoo would identify you to those people as someone they could trust." The implications of what Colonel Harrison was suggesting began to sink in. Sarah had joined the military to serve her country and build a stable career, not to become involved in the kind of shadowy intelligence work that had defined her grandfather's later years. Are you asking me to make contact with these people, sir? I'm not asking you anything yet, Sergeant. Right now, I'm simply making you aware of the situation and the significance of the tattoo you've been carrying for the past few years. Colonel, Harrison leaned back in his chair. But I will say this. Your grandfather's work saved a lot of American lives, and there may come a time when his network could do so again. When that time comes, you might be the only person who can make that contact possible. Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she had just learned. Her simple tribute to her grandfather's memory had turned out to be something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. The tattoo she had kept hidden for 3 years was not just a personal reminder of family history. It was a key that could unlock doors to a world she had never imagined entering. Colonel Harrison dismissed Sarah with instructions to think about everything they had discussed and to tell no one about their conversation. She walked back to her barracks in a daze, her mind struggling to process the revelation that her grandfather had been far more than just an old soldier with interesting stories. The man she had known as a gentle, soft-spoken grandfather who taught her to play chess and told her tales of adventure had apparently been a key intelligence asset for the United States government. Over the next few days, Sarah found it almost impossible to concentrate on her regular duties. Every time she looked in the mirror and caught a glimpse of her tattoo, she was reminded that she was carrying something that could potentially put her in danger or draw her into a world she had never wanted to enter. She began researching her grandfather's background more thoroughly, reaching out to family members she had not spoken to in years. Her Aunt Maria, her father's sister, was initially reluctant to discuss Eduardo's past. But when Sarah pressed, explaining that it had become important for her military service, Maria revealed details that confirmed many of Colonel Harrison's implications. Your grandfather never talked about those years, but we knew he was involved in something dangerous, Maria told Sarah during a long phone conversation. He would disappear for weeks at a time, come back with money and stories he couldn't tell. Your grandmother was terrified, but Eduardo said he was serving a cause bigger than himself. Maria also revealed that Eduardo had maintained contact with several other men from his network throughout the years. Some had settled in the United States, others had remained in Central America, but they had stayed in touch through coded letters and occasional visits. Eduardo had kept detailed records of these contacts along with maps and documents that Maria had stored in a safety deposit box after his death. I never knew what to do with those papers, Maria admitted. Eduardo made me promise to keep them safe, but he never explained why they were important. Maybe it's time to turn them over to someone who can use them properly. Sarah arranged to meet Maria the following weekend during her leave. The drive to El Paso gave her time to think about the decision she was facing. Colonel Harrison had not yet asked her to do anything specific, but his implications were clear. The military was interested in reactivating her grandfather's intelligence network, and Sarah was potentially the key to making that happen. The safety deposit box contained more material than Sarah had expected. Along with personal documents and family photographs, there were detailed maps of Central America marked with symbols that matched those on Sarah's tattoo. There were also lists of names, addresses, and coded references that meant nothing to Sarah but would probably be invaluable to intelligence analysts. Most surprisingly, there was a letter addressed to Sarah specifically, sealed and marked with instructions that it should only be opened if someone with official United States government authority asked her about Eduardo's intelligence work. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time before opening it. Her grandfather's handwriting was careful and precise, the words chosen with obvious thought. My dear Sarah, if you are reading this letter, it means that the work I did many years ago has become important. Again, I had hoped that the world had moved past the need for the kind of dangerous games I played, but history has a way of repeating itself. The symbols I taught you and the markings you carry are more than family history. They are keys to a network of good people who risked everything to protect innocent lives and preserve freedom. The letter went on to explain the significance of each symbol on Sarah's tattoo and provided detailed information about contacts throughout Central America who would recognize those markings. Eduardo had also included specific instructions about how to make safe contact with these individuals and the protocols for verifying their identity. I never wanted this burden to fall on you, but if it has, I trust you to use your judgment about what is right. The people in this network are not soldiers or spies in the traditional sense. They are ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when their countries and their families were threatened. If they are called upon again, it will be because the need is genuine and the cause is just. Sarah returned to Fort Campbell with her grandfather's documents and a much clearer understanding of the situation she found herself in. She also carried a deeper appreciation for the man who had raised her to value service, integrity, and the courage to do difficult things when they needed to be done. Colonel Harrison was waiting for her report. When Sarah described what she had found in the safety deposit box, his expression grew more serious than she had ever seen it. "Sergeant, I need to be completely honest with you about what's happening. We've been monitoring increased activity by hostile intelligence services throughout Central America. Several American assets have been compromised, and we believe there's a coordinated effort to eliminate people who have provided assistance to the United States over the years." He showed Sarah classified intelligence reports detailing threats against former contacts and their families. Some of the names on the threat list matched names in her grandfather's documents. Your grandfather's network includes people who are now in immediate danger. We need to warn them and, if possible, extract those who are most vulnerable. But our official channels have been compromised. The only way to make safe contact is through someone they would trust completely. Sarah understood what he was asking before he said it directly. "You want me to go to Central America and make contact with these people using my grandfather's codes? I want you to volunteer for an assignment that would be dangerous, unofficial, and completely deniable if something goes wrong. You would be operating under civilian cover with minimal backup, relying entirely on people you've never met to keep you safe." Colonel Harrison paused. "I can't order you to do this, Sergeant. It has to be your choice." Sarah thought about her comfortable life at Fort Campbell, her relationship with Marcus, her plans for the future that had seemed so clear just a week earlier. Then she thought about her grandfather's letter and the ordinary people who had risked everything to do what they believed was right. What would the mission involve specifically? You would travel to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador undercover as a graduate student researching regional history. Your job would be to locate specific individuals from your grandfather's network, warn them about the threats against them, and coordinate their evacuation if they choose to accept our help. Colonel Harrison spread a map across his desk, marking locations throughout Central America. These are the areas where we believe network members are located. Some of them haven't had contact with American intelligence in over 20 years. They won't trust official channels, but they might trust Eduardo's granddaughter. Sarah studied the map, thinking about the enormity of what was being proposed. She would be traveling alone into regions where American intelligence operatives had been killed, relying on people she had never met, and symbols tattooed on her skin to keep her alive. How long would I be gone? Minimum 3 weeks, probably. Closer to 6, depending on how many contacts you can locate and what kind of assistance they need. Colonel Harrison looked directly at Sarah. "I won't lie to you, Sergeant. This mission has a high probability of going wrong in ways we can't predict or control, but it also might be the only chance these people have to survive." Sarah closed her eyes and thought about her grandfather's gentle hands teaching her chess moves, his patient voice explaining the meaning of the symbols he was having tattooed on her skin. Eduardo Martinez had spent his later years knowing that someday someone might need to carry on the work he had started. "I need 24 hours to think about it, sir." "Take all the time you need, Sergeant. But remember that every day we delay increases the danger to the people your grandfather spent his life protecting." Sarah spent that night walking around the base thinking about the choice she faced. She could not discuss the mission with anyone, which made the decision feel even more isolating. Marcus noticed her distraction during dinner, and Jennifer commented on how quiet she had become, but Sarah could only offer vague explanations about work stress and family matters. The next morning, she returned to Colonel Harrison's office with her decision. "I'll do it, sir, but I have some conditions." Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to make conditions, Sergeant." "With respect, sir, I'm the only person who can make this mission work. That gives me some leverage." Sarah had thought carefully about what she needed to make the mission successful. "I want complete autonomy in the field. No micromanagement from handlers. No predetermined schedule that might compromise safety. I follow my grandfather's protocols and make decisions based on the situation as I find it. Agreed. What else? I want a guarantee that if this goes wrong, the military will take care of my family. My mother doesn't know about any of this, and she shouldn't have to suffer if I don't come back. Colonel Harrison nodded. That's already been arranged. What's your third condition? Sarah hesitated before answering. If I successfully complete this mission, I want the option to transfer to intelligence work permanently. No more pretending that I'm just a communications specialist who happens to have an interesting tattoo. That can be arranged, depending on how things go. Are you ready to begin preparation immediately? The next 3 weeks were the most intensive training period of Sarah's military career. She worked with intelligence specialists to memorize cover stories, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. She studied maps, learned about regional politics, and practiced the subtle skills of operating undercover in hostile territory. The most challenging part of the preparation was emotional rather than technical. Sarah had to learn to think of herself, not as Sergeant Martinez, a soldier following orders, but as Sarah Martinez, a graduate student whose grandfather had left her a legacy that could save lives. Her cover story was carefully constructed but believable. She was researching the impact of Cold War conflicts on local communities throughout Central America, with particular focus on how families had been affected by the violence of the 1980s and 1990s. This gave her legitimate reasons to ask questions about the past and to seek out people who had lived through those turbulent years. The tattoo that had started this entire chain of events would be her primary tool for establishing credibility with her grandfather's former contacts. Each symbol around the compass rose had a specific meaning that would be recognized by network members, but the codes were subtle enough that they would mean nothing to hostile intelligence services. Sarah's departure from Fort Campbell was handled with careful misdirection. Officially, she was taking extended leave to deal with family matters in Texas. Marcus was told that her grandfather's estate required her attention and that she might be gone for several weeks. Jennifer assumed that Sarah was dealing with some kind of family crisis and offered support that Sarah could not fully accept. The hardest part was leaving without being able to explain the real reason for her absence. Sarah had to watch Marcus worry about their relationship, and Jennifer wonder if she had done something wrong, knowing that she could not reassure them without compromising the mission. Her first stop was Honduras, where intelligence reports suggested that 3 members of her grandfather's network were living under assumed identities. Sarah flew into Tegucigalpa under her cover as a graduate student, carrying research materials and a carefully crafted story about her academic work. The capital city was overwhelming after the controlled environment of Fort Campbell. The streets were crowded, noisy, and filled with the kind of unpredictable energy that made surveillance difficult, but also made it hard to spot potential threats. Sarah checked into a modest hotel near the university and began the careful process of establishing her cover identity. Her first contact was supposed to be a man named Carlos Mendez, who ran a small bookstore in the older part of the city. According to her grandfather's notes, Carlos had been a courier for the network, carrying messages between safe houses and coordinating the movement of people who needed to be relocated quickly. He would now be in his 70s if he was still alive. Sarah spent 2 days observing the bookstore from a distance before approaching. She needed to be certain that Carlos was not under surveillance and that the location was safe for contact. The bookstore appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: a small business serving local customers with no signs of unusual activity or interest from authorities. When Sarah finally entered the shop, she was struck by how normal everything seemed. Carlos Mendez was a small, elderly man with gentle eyes and careful movements. He helped customers find books, made recommendations, and handled transactions with the patient efficiency of someone who had been in the same business for decades. Sarah browsed the history section, looking for an opportunity to make contact without drawing attention. She selected a book about Central American politics and approached the counter to pay. As Carlos handled her purchase, Sarah casually rolled up her sleeve to reveal the edge of her tattoo. The reaction was immediate, but subtle. Carlos's eyes widened slightly, and his hands paused for just a moment before continuing to process her purchase. He looked directly at Sarah's face, studying her features with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You have an interesting tattoo," he said quietly in Spanish. "The design is quite unusual." Sarah responded with the phrase her grandfather had taught her. "The compass points true, but the path is never straight." Carlos's entire demeanor changed. He quickly finished her transaction, then wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to her with her receipt. "There is a cafe 2 blocks north of here. Meet me there at 7 tonight. Come alone and make sure you are not followed." The piece of paper contained an address and a simple map. Sarah spent the rest of the day making sure she was not being watched, using counter-surveillance techniques she had learned during her training. At 7 o'clock, she found the cafe and located Carlos sitting at a corner table where he could watch the entrance. "You are Eduardo's granddaughter," he said without preamble when she sat down. "You have his eyes and you carry his marks. But why are you here? Eduardo has been dead for years." Sarah explained the situation carefully, describing the threats against network members and the American government's offer to provide protection. Carlos listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave as she continued. "3 of us from the old network are still alive in Honduras," he finally said. "We have stayed in contact with each other, but we have tried to live quiet lives and avoid attention. Recently, that has become more difficult." Carlos explained that all 3 surviving network members had noticed increased surveillance over the past few months. Phone calls were being monitored, mail was being intercepted, and strangers had been asking questions about their backgrounds and activities during the 1980s. "We believe it is only a matter of time before they come for us directly. The new government is very friendly with groups that opposed us during the war, and they have long memories about who helped the Americans." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that she had successfully made contact and confirmed the intelligence reports about threats to network members. Anxiety because the situation was clearly more dangerous than even the briefings had suggested. "Can you contact the other 2 survivors? We need to discuss evacuation options for all of you. They will want to meet you first, to verify that you are who you claim to be. Eduardo taught us to be very careful about trust, even with family members." Carlos paused. "Can you prove that Eduardo told you about the work we did together?" Sarah had prepared for this question. She recited specific details about operations the network had conducted, locations of former safe houses, and coded phrases that only Eduardo's most trusted associates would know. Carlos asked increasingly detailed questions, testing her knowledge of events and people from 30 years in the past. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "Eduardo prepared you well. He must have known that someday you might need to carry on his work." Carlos stood up from the table. "I will arrange for you to meet Miguel and Rosa tomorrow evening, but you should know that they may not be willing to leave Honduras. This has been their home for 40 years, and they have families here who depend on them. The choice will be theirs to make. My job is just to deliver the offer and provide assistance if they want it." That night, Sarah sent a coded message back to Colonel Harrison, confirming successful contact with the first network member. The communication protocol was complex, requiring her to use specific phrases embedded in seemingly innocent emails about her research progress. The next evening's meeting took place in the back room of a small restaurant owned by Miguel Santos, the second surviving network member. Miguel was a large, jovial man who seemed to have built a successful life after his intelligence work ended. Rosa Herrera was smaller and more reserved, but Sarah could see the sharp intelligence in her eyes that had probably made her valuable to her grandfather's network. Both Miguel and Rosa subjected Sarah to the same careful questioning that Carlos had conducted. They wanted to know not just about Eduardo's teachings, but about Sarah herself. Why had she joined the military? What did she hope to accomplish with this mission? Could she be trusted to keep network secrets if the mission went wrong? "Your grandfather saved our lives many times," Rosa finally said. "We owe him a debt that can never be repaid. But that does not mean we owe the same debt to the American government. Times have changed, and the causes we fought for may not be the same causes America supports today." Sarah had expected this reaction. Her grandfather's network had been motivated by local concerns and personal loyalties, as much as by geopolitical considerations. The surviving members had no reason to trust that American interests still aligned with their own values. "I'm not asking you to trust the American government," Sarah said. "I'm asking you to trust me and to trust the memory of Eduardo Martinez. The people who want to hurt you now are the same people who wanted to hurt you 30 years ago. The reasons may have changed, but the danger is the same." The three network members conferred quietly in rapid Spanish while Sarah waited. Finally, Carlos spoke for the group. "We will accept evacuation to the United States, but only if our families can come with us. Miguel has 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. Rosa has a daughter and 3 grandchildren. I have a nephew who depends on me for support. We will not abandon them to face retaliation for our actions." Sarah had not anticipated this complication, but she understood the logic. The network members had spent 40 years building new lives and taking care of their families. They would not sacrifice those responsibilities for their own safety. "I'll need to communicate with my contacts about expanding the evacuation to include family members. That's going to make the operation much more complex and expensive." "Then perhaps it is better if we stay and take our chances," Miguel said. "We are old, and we have lived good lives. Our families are young and have everything ahead of them." Sarah realized that she was facing the same kind of impossible choices that had defined her grandfather's work. Saving the lives of 3 elderly, intelligence assets might require putting their younger family members at risk, or it might require leaving the network members behind to face almost certain death. Sarah spent 2 days in intense communication with Colonel Harrison and his intelligence team, working out the logistics of expanding the evacuation to include family members. The operation had grown from extracting 3 elderly assets to relocating nearly 20 people, including children who would need special documentation and care. The complexity of the expanded mission was matched by its urgency. Carlos reported that surveillance of network members had intensified dramatically. Unknown individuals were asking direct questions about the 3 survivors, and Miguel's restaurant had been visited by men claiming to be health inspectors who seemed more interested in the building's layout than its compliance with regulations. "Need to move quickly," Sarah told the 3 network members during an emergency meeting. "My superiors have agreed to evacuate your families, but we have to be ready to leave Honduras within 72 hours. The evacuation plan required careful coordination. Family members would be brought to a safe house on the outskirts of Tegucigalpa, where they would receive temporary travel documents and instructions for the journey to the United States. A chartered bus would transport the group to the border with Guatemala, where they would transfer to aircraft for the final journey to safety. Sarah's role was to coordinate the movement of people and ensure that no one was left behind. She also had to maintain her cover as a graduate student while orchestrating an operation that involved dozens of moving parts and multiple government agencies. The most challenging aspect was managing the emotional impact on the families. Children, who had never been outside Honduras, were being told they had to leave everything behind immediately. Adults who had built businesses and careers were being asked to abandon their life's work. Even with the promise of safety and new opportunities in America, the evacuation felt like another kind of loss. Rosa's daughter, Carmen, was particularly resistant to leaving. She was a successful teacher with a young son, and she could not understand why her mother's activities from 40 years ago should force her to flee the only country she had ever known. "I don't even understand what my mother did that was so important," Carmen said during a tense family meeting. "She worked with Americans during the war, but the war is over. Why can't she just tell these people that she's retired and wants to be left alone?" Sarah tried to explain the situation without revealing classified details. "The work your mother did helped save lives and protect innocent people. Some of the groups that opposed her during the war are now in positions of power, and they see her as a threat to their version of history. So because of politics that I never understood or cared about, my son has to grow up in a foreign country speaking a foreign language." Sarah understood Carmen's frustration, but she also knew that the intelligence reports were clear about the level of threat facing network members and their families. The choice was not between staying in Honduras comfortably or leaving for America, reluctantly. The choice was between leaving voluntarily or being killed. The evacuation began at dawn on the third day. Sarah moved from location to location, collecting family members and ensuring that they reached the safe house without being detected. Each pickup was carefully timed to avoid patterns that might be noticed by surveillance teams. Miguel's family was the largest group, and his 5 grandchildren ranged in age from 6 to 16. The older children understood that they were fleeing some kind of danger, but the younger ones thought they were going on an exciting trip to visit America. Sarah found their innocence both heartbreaking and motivating. Carlos had the smallest family group, just his nephew and the nephew's wife, but they also had the most to lose financially. Carlos's nephew had built a small but profitable import business, and leaving immediately meant abandoning inventory and contracts that represented years of work. "I keep thinking about Eduardo's stories," Carlos told Sarah as they waited for the last family members to arrive at the safe house. "He always said that the hardest part of intelligence work was not the danger to yourself, but the way it affected the people you cared about. Now I understand what he meant." The journey to the Guatemalan border took 8 hours on roads that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The chartered bus was cramped, uncomfortable, and filled with anxious conversation as family members tried to process what was happening to their lives. Sarah spent the journey moving through the bus, checking on individuals, answering questions, and trying to maintain morale. She also stayed in constant communication with her handlers, providing updates on their progress and receiving intelligence about potential threats along their route. The border crossing was the most dangerous part of the operation. Even with official support from both governments, the process of moving 20 people with hastily prepared documentation required careful coordination and a significant amount of luck. Sarah's heart pounded as border guards examined documents and questioned family members about their reasons for leaving Honduras. The cover story was that they were part of an academic exchange program, but the story felt thin when applied to such a large and diverse group. One of Miguel's grandsons, a teenager named David, nearly compromised the entire operation when he became nervous during questioning and began to contradict the cover story. Sarah had to intervene, explaining to the guards that David was anxious about leaving home for the first time and was confused about the details of their trip. After 3 tense hours, the entire group was cleared to enter Guatemala. They transferred to aircraft for the final leg of their journey, and Sarah allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic that the mission would succeed. The flight to the United States was Sarah's first opportunity to reflect on what she had accomplished over the previous weeks. She had successfully located and evacuated 3 intelligence assets who had been marked for death, along with their families. She had honored her grandfather's legacy while serving her country's interests. She had also discovered capabilities within herself that she had never known existed. But the mission had also changed her in ways that she was still beginning to understand. She could never again see herself as just another soldier following orders. She had tasted the complex moral challenges and personal responsibilities that came with intelligence work, and she knew that her military career would never be the same. Colonel Harrison met the evacuation flight when it arrived at a military airfield in Texas. The network members and their families were taken to a secure facility for debriefing and processing while Sarah was brought to a separate location for her own debriefing. "Outstanding work, Sergeant," Colonel Harrison said as they sat in a small conference room. "You accomplished everything we hoped for and handled complications that no one could have predicted. Thank you, sir. What happens to the families now?" "They'll be given new identities and assistance in settling into communities where they can rebuild their lives safely. The network members will also be debriefed about their knowledge of other intelligence assets and operations, but their cooperation will be entirely voluntary." Sarah nodded, though she wondered how voluntary anything could really be for people who had been forced to flee their homeland. "What happens to me now, sir?" Colonel Harrison smiled. "That depends on what you want to happen. Your performance on this mission has opened doors that most soldiers never get to see. Intelligence agencies throughout the government are interested in recruiting you. You could have a very successful career in work that would make full use of your unique background and capabilities." Sarah thought about her tattoo, which had started this entire adventure. What had begun as a simple tribute to her grandfather's memory had revealed itself to be a key to a world of secrets, dangers, and moral complexities that most people never encountered. I want to continue this kind of work, sir. But I also want to make sure that what happened to those families never happens to anyone else. If I'm going to use my grandfather's legacy, I want to use it to protect people, not just to serve government interests. That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes good intelligence officers, Sergeant. Welcome to the next phase of your career. Sarah left the debriefing knowing that her life had changed permanently. She could never return to the simple certainties of her previous military service, but she also knew that she was finally doing the kind of work that her grandfather would have been proud of. Work that honored the sacrifices of ordinary people, who chose to do extraordinary things when their courage was needed most. The compass rose tattoo on her shoulder blade would never again be just a personal reminder of family history. It had become a symbol of the complex legacy she had inherited, and the responsibilities that came with carrying her grandfather's secrets into an uncertain future.